high tech, and I know how to. Is this working? Is this working? Yes, I hear myself from. But call. I need to repeat the questions. I will repeat them. Okay. So first of all, thank you for coming. It's great to see you. I am delighted to be back. My wife and I ever so often come Friday evenings to Darwin with you. I consider this one of my spiritual homes in Houston. And so thank you for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be here. And lots of faces, I think I know almost all of you. And you know who I am. My name is Matthias Henze. I'm a professor at Rice University. I teach Tanakh. And many, many years ago, I started the program in Jewish studies. That's why I'm here. So professors always talk too much at the beginning, and then they run out of time at the end. I will run out of time, but I don't want to talk too much. And so we just read the first text on your handout. There is a handout, and I have extra copies. Could you hand them behind you? There are more people coming. This handout will come in handy tonight. So why don't we just read the first text? The first text is actually not the text we're going to read tonight, but it's a text from the Mishnah. It's a text that all of you know very well, a tractate called Pirkei Avot. And I know you all know it better than I do. And we have here the very beginning of Pirkei Avot. You can go to any Mishnah, pull it off the shelf, read Pirkei Avot, and this is how Pirkei Avot, meaning the sayings of the fathers, right? It's a collection of sayings, a bit atypical for the Mishnah. And this is how it starts out. Let's just read in English. Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. They said 3 things: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. I mean, you could easily spend the hour just talking about this. I'm interested in the first sentence only. The second sentence I leave to Cantor Levine to interpret. I'm interested in the first sentence here. Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. What is actually happening here? What do the rabbis do? The rabbis establish a line of transmission that begins at Mount Sinai, the quintessential moment, and then goes straight down and ends up with them, with the rabbis. And so the claim they're making here is that what they are teaching you is not something that they dreamed up last Wednesday afternoon, but it has, in fact, a tradition. And so what matters to them is that the tradition is A, uninterrupted, there's a direct line, and that B, it starts with the authority, with Moshe on Har Sinai. So why would they want to do that? This is very much a summary of the self-understanding of the rabbis. This is how they see themselves. All of rabbinic teachings to Rashi B'al Peh, the oral transmission of the Torah, is really thought to be part of the original revelation at Mount Sinai. We shouldn't think of it as something secondary. It goes back to the original. So why do they do that? Why is this so important? Absolutely. It's all about authority. It's as a friend of mine puts it, an authority-conferring strategy. It's a strategy. And to whom do they give authority? To themselves. Of course, right? So the church does the exact same thing, by the way, and there we call it apostolic succession. What does apostolic succession mean? The Roman Catholic Church, and certainly all Orthodox churches, have their patron saints. And they say our teaching is the authoritative and, in fact, the oldest teaching. Why? Because it goes back in an uninterrupted line to one of the disciples of Jesus. Goes back to the origin, right? What is Mount Sinai in Judaism is Jesus in Christianity. It's the exact same strategy. Our church is better than yours. We've got it because our guy was there. He talked to the man himself. So this, Pirkei Avot, is the rabbinic version of apostolic succession. They say we go back to the origins, and what we say is really from Har Sinai, from Mount Sinai. But they're saying another thing. Not only do they, you're absolutely right, that's the first thing we need to say, it's all about authority, but they're saying something else. Namely, there really is no other form of Judaism. In that line, the line does not split. There is not, oh, by the way, we had a little fallout and, there are other groups. No, there's one line. And there really are no other forms of Judaism other than Rabbinic Judaism. I am flabbergasted. I'm just completely beside myself by how successful the rabbis are. It is unbelievable. And what I mean by that is that when I am invited to talk at Brith Shalom, when I talk to my rabbinic friends, that's what I hear from them. There's Rabbinic Judaism. And when I then say, look, I actually study other forms of Judaism, I get this sort of puzzled look. Like, what do you mean? Well, I'll tell you a story. When I came to Houston in 1885, I was even younger than I am right now. I was just asked how old I am. I know that's difficult to believe. I really was. I gave lectures at Rice University, my academic home, on the Dead Sea Scrolls. This Jewish sect in the Judean desert that wrote these weird texts. And I remember at the end of one lecture, a gentleman in the back row got up. He was very upset with me. And he said, I don't know what that is that you are teaching us here, but it ain't Judaism. I was a young assistant professor. And I said, oy vavoy. I don't quite know what to say to this. I didn't mean to offend. I'm just referring back to, now that I'm not so young anymore, I can tell you exactly what happened. This is a gentleman from the rabbinic tradition, and here was a form of Judaism, Judaism of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is not identical to rabbinic Judaism, which seemed foreign to him. It's like the origin of evil is a good example. The rabbis have their own idea of why we are bound to screw up. The people from Qumran, very different ideas. And I could go down there to a different calendar, a different this, a different that, but they thought differently. And to this gentleman, this was just not Judaism. What he really was saying is it's not rabbinic Judaism. So what I would like to do with you tonight, this is all by way of introducing our subject, is I want to read a text with you that is not the Bible, it's not the book of Ezra in our Bibles, and that is not rabbinic Judaism. Yes, it's shocking, but there is such a thing. And what's even more disturbing is that I'm really devoting my life to these weird texts. So when people ask me, what do you do? I say, I study weird ancient Jewish texts. And people look at me and say, oh, you mean the Bible? I mean, no, not the Bible. No, even weirder than that. Okay, so the text that I would like to read with you is called 4th Ezra. And so I start out, before we read the first text, I want to talk to you about this text. What is 4th Ezra? It's not, by the way, Ezra 4, as it is printed in the announcement. It's actually 4th Ezra. So what is it? The title, 4th Ezra, tells you already that it is a book that is attributed to Ezra. Ezra, the person in the Bible who played a major role after the turn of the Babylonian century. Exile, sorry. Yes, sir.
Go back and ask a question?
Please.
And that is a comment and make a fence around it.
Yes.
It would seem to me that's not what we want to do. In other words,
Yes.
the disciples wanted to bring Judaism
Yes.
to the people and not make a fence around it.
Yes.
Actually,
Yes.
they wanted to bring it to
Yes.
the congregation.
Yes. That's actually not what they meant. I see exactly what you're saying, but that's not how that is traditionally interpreted. The way it is traditionally interpreted is that the rabbis will come up with rules and regulations that are a little stricter than what you really ought to do in order to prevent you from even coming close to violating a rule. Right? The fence means before you even get tempted or inadvertently will break a rule, they will come up with rules and regulations that are a little removed from it in order to really protect you. You see where I'm going with that? The fence is around the...
The opposite of the way I felt. In other words,
I'm sorry.
I try to, you, rabbi,
Right.
Cantor would try and bring
Yes. And they would be fine with that, yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. All right, I want to come back to 4th Ezra. So there is the Ezra of the Bible. What happened was that more books were written later on that were then attributed to this Ezra, even though he never wrote this book. This thing we call pseudepigraphy. Is that on your handout? It's sort of a mouthful, isn't it? Pseudepigraphy means you write a book, but you don't put your own name on it. You attribute it to a figure of the past, such as a biblical figure. Ezra was a very famous name in whose name people, a pseudonym, in whose name people wrote texts. And since there are so many, people started to attach numbers to it. There's a 1st Ezra, 2nd Ezra, and 3rd Ezra. So it gets very, very confusing. Pseudepigraphy means you're writing under the name of a different author. So where's this book found? If you go to Barnes & Noble and you get yourself a thick Bible, it will say the Holy Bible or whatever, the New Oxford Annotated Bible. Then it tells you what kind of a translation it is. And then it says, with the Apocrypha, if you spend $3 extra or so, you get yourself the deluxe edition, like this one here. So what does with the Apocrypha mean? This particular Bible has the Tanakh in it, the Hebrew Bible. It has the New Testament, the second part of the Christian Bible. And then it has a third part in it. And that third part is called the Apocrypha. So what are the Apocrypha? The Apocrypha are writings from the late Second Temple period. These are all Jewish texts. They didn't quite make the cut. They didn't quite make it into the Hebrew Bible, but they did make it into something that's called the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the first translation of the Bible from the 3rd century BCE, made in Alexandria in Egypt. And so for some reason, the Jewish community in Egypt had in their Bibles all the books that we have in our Bible and a few extra ones. And the few extra ones we call the Apocrypha. Apocryphon is a Greek term, and it means hidden. So they're not quite as in broad daylight as everything else. And so if you were to get your Bible with the Apocrypha, you will find in it a book which is called 2nd Esdras. That's on your handout. And now it gets a little goofy, for which I apologize. 2nd Esdras, one of the apocryphal books, consists itself of 3 books, and we call them 5th Ezra, that's the first 2 chapters, 4th Ezra, chapters 3 through 14, and 6th Ezra, chapters 15 and 16. That's just to confuse you, really. That's the purpose. 5th Ezra and 6th Ezra, the first 2 chapters and the last 2 chapters, are Christian texts. So whoever put this together wanted to say, look, we put the Jewish text in the middle, but for you, just to make sure that you read it with these glasses here, with the right glasses, you put a Christian text at the beginning and a Christian text at the end, just to make sure you get it right. So 4th Ezra, the biggest middle text there, is a Jewish apocalypse from the late 1st century, written possibly in the land of Israel. We don't quite know this for sure. It is set 30 years after the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. That's its fictitious setting, that is at the time of Ezra. But it was actually written in response to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, that is the destruction of the Second Temple, namely during the time of the actual author. Say this again. This is the person who writes a generation or 2 after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70. He is reflecting on the question, how could this be? How can it be that God allows a heathen nation to just waltz in and destroy everything? But rather than writing in his own voice, and rather than writing in his own time, the author chooses to write a historical narrative. He goes back to the first destruction and puts the entire action, everything, in the mouth of Ezra. This is what we call pseudepigraphy. You write in the pseudonym of a biblical hero, and rather than setting everything in the actual time, you put it in the past. So that he was writing in Israel during the Roman occupation. So when he refers to the Babylonians, he's not really writing about the Babylonians, he's writing about the Romans. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's an excellent question. So in what language was it written and how is it preserved is your question. And the answer is we don't have the original, but very smart scholars, whom I respect a lot, have argued that it was originally written in Hebrew and that it was then translated into Greek. And you will be shocked to hear we have no Hebrew and we have no Greek. And then from the Greek, it was translated into many other languages. The two most important ones are Latin and Syriac. Syriac is an Aramaic dialect. Syriac is an Aramaic dialect. So how do we know this book? No, the Septuagint was in Egypt. This book was written in Israel. So why is the Latin important? Because we know this book from the Latin translation of the Bible, a Christian translation called the Vulgate. It's one of several Latin versions of the Bible. And the Vulgate, this is all very complicated, and I'm not personally responsible for this. I just point this out. Has an appendix in the end. There's certain books that are added on to certain versions of the Vulgate, and one of them is our book here, which is why my Roman Catholic friends, who in fact follow the Vulgate, say this is part of our Bible. So if you look at the scholarship on 4th Ezra, you'll see that most of them are Roman Catholics, because to them this is the Bible. The Syriac is also very important because it's a Semitic version of it, and it was perhaps part of the Syriac Bible. This is all very confusing, I apologize for this. But it does survive in these two versions, and in many, it was a very popular text in the church, not in Judaism, but in the church. And Syriac and Latin are important languages for the Oriental churches that preserved these texts.
So you started talking about Pharisees.
Yes.
The Ezra and the Pharisees have any relationship to each other?
Is it?
Independently or against them?
So independently, this is not a Pharisaic text, but there are lots of points of connection. And our author wrote during the 1st century, and of course there were Pharisees and rabbis around at this time. So there are multiple points of connection, but I would not go so far as to say that the author himself was a... Yes.
Member of a opposing sect?
We have no idea. All we have is the text. So one last thing, and then we start reading. Look at the composition. That's one of the most remarkable things about this text, is how it is composed. Namely, and you have this on your handout, it has 7 parts to it. So you see that the first 3 parts take the form of a dialogue between the angel Uriel and Ezra. Ezra wants to know all kinds of things from the angel. Why did God destroy Jerusalem? Are the Babylonians any better than we are? What exactly were you thinking, God, when you created us and you gave us the Torah? You knew exactly what would happen. So there's all kinds of questions. And Ezra pushes the angel very much. So part of the appeal of the book is how aggressive this Ezra is. Again, this is not the biblical Ezra. This is a different Ezra. He's just relentlessly pushing and pushing. He wants answers from the angel. The 4th part, which we will read, in the 4th part, Ezra meets a mourning woman. And we'll read this text in just a second. And then parts 5 and 6 take the form of symbolic dream visions. That means apocalyptic visions. This text is an apocalypse. And then the 7th part, the final episode, we'll also read parts of. So there's a very neat structure of the book that is easy to follow as you read through it. What I want to do with you is read a little bit from the very beginning, then I want to read a part from the middle section, and then the end. And then it'll be 11:30, 12, and then you're all tired and you want to go home. Okay, let's begin with the very beginning of the book. This is text number 1 on your handout, page 2 of your handout. In the 30th year after the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, obviously, I was in Babylon, I, Salatiel, who am also called Ezra. I was troubled as I lay on my bed, and my thoughts welled up in my heart, because I saw the desolation of Zion and the wealth of those who lived in Babylon. My spirit was greatly agitated, and I began to speak anxious words to the Most High and said, O sovereign Lord, did you not speak at the beginning when you planted the earth, and that without help? and commanded the dust, and it gave you, Adam, a lifeless body. Yet he was the creation of your hands, and you breathed into him the breath of life, and he was made alive in your presence. And he goes on and on and on, retells the history of Israel. So that's the beginning of the book. What do we see here? How does the author start out? First, just as a reminder, this is a pseudepigraphon. It's pseudepigraphy. The author writes in the first person singular of Ezra, our biblical Hebrew. Ezra he introduces himself by the name Salatiel. The Hebrew version of that would be Sha'altiel, meaning something like I inquired, I asked God, I inquired of God. A by name that does not show up in the book again. It's just at the very beginning. So he is the one who's questioning God, right? Sha'alti God. Notice that there is a date formula here in the 30th year after the destruction. That is the destruction, the first destruction under the Babylonians. The date formula is taken from the beginning of the book of Ezekiel. And so apocalyptic literature is a little tricky in that we want to calculate, now which year is it? But it's all about the symbolic value. Here it is the symbolism borrowed from the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel, you will recall, is also a prophet associated with exile. And so it's really imagery that shouldn't be taken literally. And then notice in verse 2 in this brief passage here, because I saw the desolation of Zion and the wealth of those who lived in Babylon. That is one of the central themes of our book, namely the desolation of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is destroyed, and the wealth of Babylon, which is really not Babylon, it really is Rome, because our author is writing during Roman times. So right from the get-go, we are introduced to the main question the author is trying to figure out. How can that be, that Jerusalem is destroyed and the Romans are triumphant? All right, that's just by way of introducing our book. Now let's turn to text number 2. Text number 2 is the middle part. It's really the turning point of the whole book. It's a fairly long text. I'm going to read it to you, and then I will ask you what is happening here and what jumps out at you. Then I will shut up and bring it over to you. So I went, as he, the angel, directed me, into the field that is called Ardat. There I sat among the flowers and ate of the plants of the field, and the nourishment they afforded satisfied me. After 7 days, while I lay on the grass, my heart was troubled again, as it was before. And then I left out a long section where Ezra, like in the beginning, is complaining to God. When I said these things in my heart, I looked around, and on my right I saw a woman. She was mourning and weeping with a loud voice, and was deeply grieved at heart. Her clothes were torn, and there were ashes on her head. Then I dismissed the thoughts with which I had been engaged, and turned to her and said to her, "Why are you weeping, and why are you grieved at heart?" She said to me, "Let me alone, my Lord, so that I may weep for myself and continue to mourn, for I am greatly embittered in spirit and deeply distressed." I said to her, "What has happened to you? Tell me." And she said to me, "Your servant was barren and had no child, though I lived with my husband for 30 years. Every hour and every day during those 30 years, I prayed to the Most High night and day, and after 30 years, God heard your servant and looked upon my low estate and considered my distress and gave me a son. I rejoiced greatly over him, I and my husband and all my neighbors, and we gave great glory to the Mighty One. And I brought him up with much care. So when he grew up, and I came to take a wife for him, I set a day for the marriage feast. But it happened that when my son entered his wedding chamber, he fell down and died. So all of us put out our lamps, and all my neighbors attempted to console me. I remained quiet until the evening of the second day. But when all of them had stopped consoling me, encouraging me to be quiet, I got up in the night and fled, and came to this field as you see. And now I intend not to return to the town, but to stay here I will neither eat nor drink, but will mourn and fast continually until I die." Then I broke off the reflections with which I was engaged and answered her in anger and said, "You most foolish of women, do you not see our mourning and what has happened to us? For Zion, the mother of us all, is in deep grief and great distress. It is most appropriate to mourn now because we are all mourning, and to be sorrowful because we are all sorrowing. You are sorrowing for one son, but we, the whole world, for our mother." And then he goes on and on and on, lashes out at her. It's not really a nice Ezra. He tells her to go home, and she refuses to go home. She says, "No, I will stay in the field." While I was talking to her, her face suddenly began to shine exceedingly. Her countenance flashed like lightning, so that I was too frightened to approach her, and my heart was terrified. While I was wondering what this meant, she suddenly uttered a loud and fearful cry, so that the earth shook at the sound. When I looked up, the woman was no longer visible to me, but a city was being built, and a place of huge foundations showed itself. I was afraid and cried with a loud voice and said, "Where's the angel Uriel, who came to me at first? For it was he who brought me into this overpowering bewilderment. My end has become corruption and my prayer a reproach." So Uriel shows up. There he is. Uriel answered me and said, "Listen to me, and I will teach you and tell you about the things that you fear. For the Most High has revealed many secrets to you. He has seen your righteous conduct, and that you have sorrowed continually for your people and mourned greatly over Zion. This, therefore, is the meaning of the vision. The woman who appeared to you a little while ago, whom you saw mourning and whom you began to console, you do not now see the form of a woman, but that appeared to you a city being built, who told you about the misfortune of her son. This is the interpretation. The woman whom you saw is Zion, which you now behold as a city being built. And as for her telling you that she was barren for 30 years, the reason is that there were 3,000 years in the world before any offering was brought in it. And after 3,000 years, Solomon built the city and offered offerings. Then it was that the barren woman bore a son. As for her telling you that she brought him up with much care, that was the period of residence in Jerusalem. And as for her saying to you, my son died as he entered his wedding chamber, and that misfortune had overtaken her, this was the destruction that befell Jerusalem. So you saw her likeness, how she mourned for her son, and you began to console her for what had happened. For now the Most High, seeing that you are sincerely grieved and profoundly distressed for her, has shown you the brilliance of her glory, the loveliness of her beauty. Therefore, I told you to remain in the field where no house had been built, for I knew that the Most High would reveal these things to you. Therefore, I told you to go into the field where there was no foundation of any building, because no work of human construction could endure in a place where the city of the Most High was to be revealed. Therefore, do not be afraid, and do not let your heart be terrified, but go in and see the splendor of the vastness of the building, as far as possible for your eyes to see. And afterward, you will hear as much as your ears can hear. For you are more blessed than many, and you have been called to be with the Most High, as few have been. All right, so this literature can be a little difficult to follow. It's different. So let's first try to understand what's happening here. The angel sends Ezra into a field, and in the passage just before the one that we read together, he eats of the flowers of the field. Then he sits down and he encounters a woman. The woman is mourning over the death of her son, is inconsolable. Ezra scolds her. Ezra is angry with her. And then she transforms into a city. He is shocked, calls for help for Uriel, It's always nice to have an angel at your side who explains to you. You know, when I took exam, I could have used an Uriel whispering into my ear. And Uriel then explains to Ezra the vision that he just had and says the woman is really a personification of Jerusalem. And what he's seen really is the history of Jerusalem, 3,000 years of barrenness. Then Solomon, it says here, Solomon built the city. Of course, Solomon did not build the city. He built the temple. Temple and city in this literature are often the same. There's a period of offerings being brought, and then the city was destroyed. And so what Ezra is seeing now is, in fact, the heavenly Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem that appears before him. So this is really a vision that wants to give comfort to Ezra and the readers, that there is a heavenly Jerusalem, and Ezra is singled out by God as the one who gets to see it. That's the story. Now I hand it over to you. What do you see? What jumps out at you? What do you make out of this story? What do you think is this story meant to convey? And we're not playing Guess What's on the Professor's Mind. I don't have the 3 things that we absolutely need to cover. I run with what you want to see.
There's a Torah, what?
Yes.
I'm embarrassed, I can't remember her name.
Yes.
But there's a woman who goes to the temple and is crying, and someone thinks she's drunk. Hannah? Okay.
The mother of Samuel. Yes. Yeah. Yes. I think you're absolutely right. What you're alluding to is the motif of a woman who cannot have a son. And that, of course, runs through the Tanakh. It starts in Genesis, mind you. Sarah is the most famous example, but there are many others. And it's picked up in the New Testament as well, of course. Barrenness is a potent motif that is in our text as well, which is devastating. I think of this, I should have said something about the current situation in which we're in, the horrible, horrible images of, and I think of my children all the time. Children are the future. Children are life, right? It's so, so important. And so barrenness, my students don't get this. It's quite because they're young, right? And I read with them biblical texts, and it talks about women who cannot have children. And they say, oh, that's nice. And I go, no. I understand you're young. This is for Genesis and for Hannah as well. It's like a death sentence. It's very strong. And that's exactly the language here. So I think that's a great observation. Other observation. What else do you see? There's so much going on here in the text. Look at the text. Don't look at me. Look at your handout.
He's saying that eventually, even though Jerusalem is destroyed, God will bring them.
There you go. That's the message, right? So this text we call an apocalypse for exactly that reason. I think you are spot on. And Ezra is privileged. It says at the end, right, God has seen that you continuously mourn for Jerusalem. You've been a faithful mourner, and therefore Ezra is singled out, privileged, that he gets to see the heavenly Jerusalem that unfortunately you and I will have to wait just a little longer until we get to see it ourselves. That's really, if we understand that, we understand a lot about what this literature is really all about. So just to finish that thought, and then one second, hold on one second, and then again. The first 3 parts of this book, we looked at the structure, are all dialogue between Ezra and the angel. And I would love to read that with you. What you will see is that the dialogue really doesn't get anywhere. Ezra asks great questions. The questions are more interesting than the answers that Uriel gives. That's sort of the nature of the beast. But if you were to ask me, okay, Professor, what's the result? I would have very little to say. And so the composition of the book is such that at the beginning, you have all of these questions, and they're sort of left in limbo. And then you have the visions, the dream visions, in the 4th, 5th, and 6th part of the book. And they are, as you point out, the answer. That's an apocalyptic way of thinking. The answer is the heavenly Jerusalem. I think you're absolutely right. Yes, sir.
Well, I mean, just flesh out the metaphor. The fact that she loses her son, if she is Jerusalem,
Yes.
it will have now the spiritual Christ.
There you go. Absolutely. Say more? You left us in the crisis. There you go. Yes. Yes. That's exactly right. That's the end. Exactly. That's the end of the line. That I think you beautifully understood what this text is all about. 100%. Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Oh, yeah. And you know, I left out the juicy parts. I mean, he is really a jerk. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be saying it. But I sat there and I typed with my tender fingers this beautiful handout. I said, no, I will cut this. He is really not coming across as a particularly nice guy. And my colleagues who work on this text, they've wondered why. Why? Why does the author portray Ezra in such a negative light? We have to be, there's no excuse for the way in which he talks about it. And several of my, oh, you want to answer this for me? I will answer my own question, but you have, let me answer it first and then I take you, okay. So many answers, I can't believe this. One of my teachers whom I revere very much is Professor Michael Stone at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, who has devoted really the better part of his life to working on this text. And he has claimed, which not everybody believes, that this kind of literature is not simply a literary fabrication. This is not something that somebody wrote because it is so clever. But for us to understand this literature, we have to assume that there is a real religious experience on the part of the author that underlies it. And for this text in particular, Professor Stone argues that it is really a conversion experience. Namely, Ezra is not the same after this encounter. In the first part, he is very pushy with the angel, relentlessly pushy and stubborn. He doesn't give in, much like the woman herself, when she talks to Ezra, is also inconsolable and doesn't give in. And when she turns into a city, Ezra changes dramatically. And so my scholar friends and Professor Stone have argued, and I think quite successfully, that there's an Ezra before this vision experiences religious wings and an Ezra thereafter. And the one before is not a nice guy, and the Ezra of the second is much more understanding. He mellows, he becomes more understanding. You see where I'm going with this? Absolutely. And what we're seeing in the second part is that's the Ezra whom we see afterwards. He changes because of this experience in the field. It has a profound impact on him. Okay, let's do one more observation and then we go to the next. Yes, of course. Uh-huh. Yes, yes. Yes. Crazy. You know, this is a story that you find in rabbinic literature a lot. Exactly this story. We're talking about like parallels between this literature and rabbis. That's a very common trope, and it has a bit of the taste of a folk tale, right? It's sort of like a common story that conveys a certain message, right? It's a literary trope. Again, the rabbis will use the wedding chamber. You find it in the book of Tobit as well. That's another of these crazy apocryphal stories. You find it pretty widely. All right, with that in mind, let's go. One, yes.
Is there a connection to the 30 years that you mentioned in the first sentence?
Yes, of course.
And 30 years.
Yes, of course. And then the 30 years at the very beginning from Ezekiel 1:1 and the 30 years there, absolutely. Many scholars have pointed this out. It's an, again, allusion to exile of... It's not the same 30 years. No, it's a trope. When we read apocalyptic literature, we just have to acknowledge that these are images, these are ciphers. All right, how does the book end? How does the book end? And now we jump to text number 4. This is Ezra 14. Text number 3. Text number 3, 4th Ezra 14, at the bottom of page 3. On the third day, while I was sitting under an oak, suddenly a voice came out of a bush opposite me and said, Ezra, Ezra. And I said, Here I am, Lord. And I rose to my feet. Then he said to me, I revealed myself in a bush and spoke to Moses when my people were in bondage in Egypt. And I sent him and led my people out of Egypt. And I led him up on Mount Sinai, where I kept him with me many days. I told him many wondrous things and showed him the secrets of the times and declared to him the ends of the times. Then I commanded him, saying, These words you shall publish openly, and these you shall keep secret. And now I say to you, lay up in your heart the signs that I've shown you, the dreams that you have seen, and the interpretations that you have heard. For you shall be taken up from among humankind, and henceforth you shall live with my Son and with those who are like you, until the times are ended. The age has lost its youth, and the times begin to grow old. Don't we all? Ezra is told to speak to the people one last time. I skip over that. Then I answered and said, Let me speak in your presence, Lord, for I will go as you have commanded me, and I will reprove the people who are now living. But who will warn those who will be born hereafter? The world lies in darkness, and it's without light. For your law has been burned, and things which have been done or will be done by you. If then I have found favor with you, send the Holy Spirit into me, and I will write everything that has happened in the world from the beginning, the things that were written in your law, that is the Torah, right? So that people may be able to find the path, and that those who want to live in the last days may do so. He answered me and said, Go and gather the people and tell them not to seek you for 40 days. But prepare for yourself many writing tablets, and take with you Sareah, Dabria, Selemia, Ethanos, and Aziel, these 5 who are trained to write rapidly. And you shall come here, and I will light in your heart the lamp of understanding, which shall not be put out until what you are about to write is finished. And then, when you have finished, some things you shall make public, some you shall deliver in secret to the wise. Tomorrow at this hour you shall begin to write. Then Ezra goes off and talks to the community in Jerusalem. So I took 5 men, as he commanded me, and we proceeded to the field and remained there. And on the next day a voice called me, saying, Ezra, open your mouth and drink what I give you to drink. So I opened my mouth, and a full cup was offered to me. It was full of something like water, but its color was like fire. I took it and drank, and when I had drunk it, my heart poured forth understanding, and wisdom increased in my breast. For my spirit retained its memory. We should all be so lucky. My spirit retained its memory. And my mouth was opened and was no longer closed. Moreover, the Most High gave understanding to the 5 men, and by turns they wrote what was dictated, using characters that they did not know. They sat 40 days. They wrote during the daytime and ate their bread at night. But as for me, I spoke in the daytime, and I was not silent at night. So, during the 40 days, 94 books were written. And when the 40 days were ended, the Most High spoke to me, saying, Make public the 24 books that you wrote first, and let the worthy and the unworthy read them. But keep the 70 that were written last, in order to give them to the wise among your people. For in them is the spring of understanding, the fountain of wisdom, and the river of knowledge. And I did so. The end. Actually, not quite. There's a Latin version and a Syriac version, and in the Syriac version, Ezra ascends into heaven after this. He is taken up into heaven. But that's not of interest to me. Okay, so what's happening? How's the book ending? Let's look at the beginning of the chapter. The first thing you see is Ezra is described like Moses. Everything, like Ezra is the second Moses. On that, the rabbis will agree. The rabbis teach, just as Moses gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai, so Ezra gave us the Torah after the return of the Babylonian exile. Right? That's common rabbinic teaching. And so you see how similar tropes, similar core theological beliefs show up in rabbinic literature, and they show up in these writings, but they're developed somewhat differently. It's the same idea. Right? Ezra is described as a new Moses. Can you point? Let's do the obvious. What are some mosaic elements in the text at the beginning of the chapter? Just shout them out. But here I am, Hineni, of course. Yes, Ezra, right? Moshe. God speaking to him, of course. And the burning bush and 40 days. Okay, it's too obvious. Sorry, I didn't mean to insult you. Okay, what else?
I have a question.
Please.
Who is the son?
Yes, yeah, I know. Where's the son? I know. So, yes, such a great question. So the rabbis really didn't like 4th Ezra. I know this comes as a shock. Jews in antiquity, they didn't really like the Apocrypha. So all the manuscripts, and when I say all, what I'm really trying to say is all, are Christian manuscripts. And so that raises the obvious question, how truthful were they? Did they perhaps ever so often, insert a little extra? And certainly the Latin manuscripts that we have are Christian manuscripts, right? And the Son makes an appearance here or there. And so we have to negotiate. Was that really there? Or may perhaps a Christian author have embellished the text a little bit, just as they put 5th Ezra as the beginning and 6th Ezra as the end? There are subtle and not so subtle ways. So it's the Messiah, obviously, who is identified as my son. Okay, so what is the main theme here? I think there are two themes. I propose to you that this chapter has two themes. Theme number 1, Ezra as the new Moses. Theme number 2, the writing of 94 books. Right? So God tells, or the angel tells Ezra, you come, bring 5 scribes who can type like really fast. Then he drinks this goblet. Sounds a bit like Harry Potter to me. And then for 40 days, hello Moses, he just talks day and night. These poor scribes. They must have been pretty stressed. Okay, at the end of all of this, we're left with 94 books. But they're not all the same. So what the author says through Uriel to Ezra is that they divide into 24 and 70. And he says the 24 you can give to everybody. Even us, even me, a verstunkener Stunk, can read these 24 books. It's okay, they're for everybody. Scholars are in wide agreement that that's a reference to the Bible. Or the rabbis will teach that the Bible consists of 24 books. And so there's wide agreement that this is in fact the first reference to the Tanakh, consisting of 24. The earliest reference in any Jewish writing is what you just read, that the Tanakh consists of 24 books. And how you count this, that's for another lecture. But then there are the other 70 books. And there he says, those you shall not give to everybody, but rather you give them, what does the text say? To the wise, what's that? Absolutely. And so these are books. Unfortunately, the author forgot to include a table of contents. It doesn't tell us which books there are. Why are they so cool? Well, because they have, if you look at the very end, they are the spring of understanding, the fountain of wisdom, and the river of knowledge. He does not say that about the biblical books. Bummer, that would be great. He says, no, it's these 70 books. So now we're coming back to your question about authorship. Who wrote this thing and why? It's an apocalypse, obviously. You explained to us beautifully, it gives hope by talking about the heavenly Jerusalem. The seer, that is Ezra, has access already to this, but the author goes a step further. He says, look, we've got some writings. We, the wise, I have no doubt that the author considered himself part of this group, the wise, who, by the way, I also mentioned in the book of Daniel. There's also a group of the wise there. We've got some texts that not everybody has got, and they include stuff that you guys can only dream of. They are the fountain of knowledge. So what we have here is the distinction between esoteric and exoteric, between readily available at Fondren Library on the Rice campus and hidden literature. And I think this notion of secrecy is very dominant in this text, right? It assumes that there's a certain group of people that have certain texts that are not widely available. And that is where the rabbis and our authors part company. That the rabbis would never claim. The rabbis never claim there are certain texts, right, that not everyone, of course they say with a certain age or so, but this notion of secrecy, which ultimately goes back to claims to revelation. God revealed certain things only to a small group of elect people, is foreign to the rabbis and is at the heart of 4th Ezra. I would go one step further and then I take your questions. I think it fairly likely that the author thinks that his own book that we just read, 4th Ezra, is part of the 70, right? It's for the wise. It's for us. We are reading it. We are now the wise. But it is part of a larger library of other texts that not everybody reads, but only parts of this community will read. And he makes a very strong claim at the end, namely a claim to revelation, a claim to, look, these books include a certain knowledge that goes well beyond. The people at Qumran made exactly the same claim. They said, God revealed stuff to us that is not readily available. It's a common trope of sects in general. I saw a few questions.
The 70, wasn't it 70 rabbis who...
The translation of the Septuagint is the same idea, yes. Again, it's a trope, right?
One thing that intrigued me is that Torah went from Moses to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and then to the prophets.
Yes.
Moses, Joshua, and the prophets were all selected by God.
Yes.
And then we have the elders. They're just selected by man.
Says you.
Oh.
Says you.
They selected by man.
No, but sure, if you were to ask them, they would say, of course, they're selected by man, but with a divine intention, right? I mean, it's not haphazard or so. It's an extension of what, right?
Worldly godliness.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes, with their authority at least. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes. Not quite. Up to a point. This I would call the community behind our text a sect. There's something sectarian, and I would not call, am I correct in not calling the rabbis a sect? Or you come in, you tell me. No. What? Say it again. In the early... By sect, yeah. By sect, I would say, let's go back to, I talk about 4th Ezra, you talk about the rabbis. So when I talk about sect, I talk about a group that self-segregates from everybody else and that defines its own existence by making claims to revelation. We know something, there's something secret that we know that nobody else knows, and therefore we are better and we will guard this knowledge from the outside. Right? Okay. 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 Yeah. Okay. So then I'm happy with it. I mean, if you say that 4th Ezra is really like another rabbinic text, that's how I started out, right? I said there are points of comparison. Does that satisfy? Yes. Okay. I see you nodding. You had your hand up. Yes. 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 Yeah. Very good. So the authors of early Jewish apocalyptic texts claim that they are living in the end of days. They think that this is the last installment of history. Time has almost run out, and so they devote themselves to the study of these texts in order to be ready for God to intervene and bring an end to history as we know it. So they think that they're living close to the edge, and they are studying for that very reason. Yes, I agree with you. Absolutely. Yes, yes, there are many connections. And Fourth Ezra is just one text. I mean, from the same period, there are many, many other texts that are similar to it. The most famous of them all is a text called First Enoch, named after Enoch in the book of Genesis. Then there's another text that is closely related to this one. It's called Second Baruch, named after Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah, which is even, I think, more sophisticated than this text. So there's a whole library. I don't know whether I could mention 70 to you, but there are several. Did you have your hand up? Yes, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Yes. Yes, yes. Yes. Nice. Yes, yes, yes. Uh-huh. Yes. 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 Right. I see what you're saying. Yes, yeah. Yes and no. So I think you're onto something. My colleagues and I don't like to name anything Christianity that happened in the first century because I prefer the term Jesus movement or followers of Jesus, because Christianity to me implies a religion that very self-consciously defines itself in opposition to, say, Judaism or other. And such a thing really didn't exist in the first century. It came slowly into existence. Different people will give you different answers, right? I would say, you're lucky that you have me because I have the answer to this. It's the second half of the second century when there are Christian church fathers, we call them, who draw the line and begin to distinguish between orthodoxy and heresy. They say, look, I'm right and you're wrong, and here's why. That's a fairly new thing in the second half of the second century. And so we should be careful not to speak of Christianity, I think, in the first century. So just very quickly, and then we need to wrap this up. I'm teaching a class on biblical ethics right now at Rice with quite a number of students, many from a conservative Christian background. And they will always read their Christian ethics back into the Bible. And I'm standing on my head and say, don't. What you're doing is you're bringing your own Christian glasses, and of course you find in the Bible what you want, but it's just not there. They won't hear me. No, they look at me and say, well, professor, perhaps you don't see it, but for me it's crystal clear. And then I say, look, this is a doctrine in Christianity that was developed in the 3rd and 4th century. We're talking about St. Augustine, very influential. And of course, these Christians referred back to both what to them is the Old Testament and New Testament, but it's just not in the text. And they say, what are you talking about? Seriously, I mean, and so that's why I'm saying we should be careful not to say there was a full-blown Christianity that is reflected in this text. It really was a Jesus movement, rather insignificant. This is a Jewish text. Of course, it has a lot to do with the Jesus movement, but that's not Christianity as a whole. I want to wrap this up, and then we'll see where we are, because we're already 1 minute over time. And to my German psyche, this is deeply, deeply offensive. So I want to, no, we're not staying as long as I want. We really would be here all night. So I want to end with a so what question. So what? I mean, you're so good to come out and read 4th Ezra. I mean, if this doesn't get you into the Olam Haba, I don't know what will. Who cares about 4th Ezra? Seriously, who cares about the Apocrypha? Who cares about these non-biblical, non-rabbinic Jewish texts? So let me attempt to give 3 reasons for why we should, in fact, pay attention, why this is worth our otherwise perfectly fine evening. So first, I come back to how we started out the evening, simply to acknowledge that Judaism of the late Second Temple period was incredibly diverse. I think that just needs to be said. Think of the Dead Sea Scrolls that I mentioned earlier on. There you have a group that writes a particular form of texts. Then there's Hellenistic Judaism. Hellenistic is a fancy term for Greek Judaism. You will have heard the name Josephus. You will have heard of Philo of Alexandria. Brilliant thinkers, brilliant historians, and absolutely not rabbinic in their approach. Hellenistic Judaism is a real thing. So what I'm saying is we need to acknowledge that they existed in spite of how Pirkei Avot starts out. Pretending that these non-rabbinic Jewish groups didn't exist or that they are somehow not Judaism doesn't make them go away. They're there, and there's an unbelievable, this I will insist on, there's an unbelievable richness in these texts, and we should acknowledge the beauty of the diversity of Judaism at the turn of the Common Era. So that's the first reason why we should pay attention. Reason number 2. The rabbis want you to believe that rabbinic Judaism emerged out of the Hebrew Bible. That's what we just read in Pirkei Avot. The rabbis want you to believe there's the Tanakh, and then there's the rabbis. You turn a page, and there you go. Early Christians, the followers of Jesus, I correct myself, will make the exact same case. There is the Old Testament. The Christian Old Testament ends with the book of Malachi, a prediction of the day of the Lord. You flip the page, and you're in the Gospel of Matthew, that starts out with the genealogy of Jesus, the purpose of which is to say, look, he is royal blood. He comes from the line of David. So there is a direct line from Malachi into Matthew. So the rabbis and the followers of Jesus both claim that they emerged straight out of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And, well, I hate to break it to you, they didn't. Neither of them did. But rather, rabbinic Judaism emerged out of Second Temple Judaism, out of the Judaism that is, in fact, historically speaking, in between the Hebrew Bible that had been finished, that's over, and the early rabbinic movement, just as the followers of Jesus emerged out of this plurality of Jewish groups during the Second Temple period. Initially, rabbinic Judaism was one of many Jewish groups. Much of what the rabbis present as original or new is, in fact, derived from earlier sources. And I would be happy to give you very concrete examples of something that we read in rabbinic literature, and we think it's all new and has never been there. And now with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can actually reach back 100 and 200 years. My colleagues work on this. Halacha, for example, halachic decisions. Lots in the scrolls that's picked up in the Mishnah or the calendar. Or, I mean, I could go on biblical interpretation. It's all there already, only that the rabbis didn't use footnotes. They didn't really tell us where they got this stuff from. So the second reason why I think this is important is it explains a whole lot about the origin of rabbinic Judaism. And I would make, by the way, the exact same claim about Christianity. I give talks in churches as well and say, don't tell me that Jesus walked out of the Old Testament. He didn't. Jesus walked out of Second Temple Judaism. It's not the same. And third, perhaps these texts are not so bad and threatening after all. Perhaps we should just overcome our gag impulse and just read them. Perhaps they're even worth reading. Or perhaps there's some theological significance to these texts. And so the last thing I will say is I ask a question. Can we allow ourselves to find theological richness and meaning in texts that are not part of our canon. So this again, can we allow to find beauty, significance, and yes, theological meaning in texts that are not part of our canons? I leave you with that question, and I thank you very much for coming out. The Karaites, later on, early Middle Ages, so much later. Am I taking questions? Yeah, I will.